My name is Mariana, and I'm an educator at the Natural History Museum of Utah. And today I'll be leading our question and answer part of the research class live. So welcome everybody who's watching with us. Remember, if you want to leave a question for our special guest today, just press the ask a question button or leave a comment on Facebook. So today we have a special guest from the Natural History Museum of Utah, Dr. Randall Armes. He's the chief curator and creator of paleontology at the museum. So hello, Randall. Randy, how are you?
Great. How about you? Thanks so much for having me.
I'm good. Thank you so much for participating. And I think I'd like you to start talking about like your work at the museum and your like research.
Yeah, I'm really lucky to be able to work at the museum, not only with all the awesome people that work there, but also the amazing collections. And one of the things I really love is that, you know, no 2 days are the same at the museum. One day you could be doing research on a new fossil specimen in the lab or in the collections, another day working with exhibits or working with the school program staff on a new project. So I love that you get to address science across the board, from doing field work to sharing it with the public.
That's so awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for helping us with the school programs.
Oh, it's a lot of fun.
That's so cool. And I think I would like to know, like, what about like your research, like with like dinosaurs?
So I really love doing research. That's one of the most fun parts of the job, because you're discovering things that no one else knows about, and then you get to share it with other scientists and people who visit the museum. And most of my research takes place during the age of dinosaurs, so the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And sort of very big picture, I'm interested how animals and other organisms on land evolved through time in response to things like climate change or change of the arrangement of the continents, other environmental change. And recently, at least, a lot of my work has focused on two different time periods. One is the Triassic period, which is the very beginning of the age of dinosaurs, and not only is it cool because that's when the first dinosaurs show up, but a lot of the modern animals we think of today on land first show up during that time. So you have the first crocodile ancestors, the first frogs and salamanders, the first lizards, the first mammals. And then it's also a time interval that has mass extinction events at both ends. So the very beginning and the very end of the Triassic period both have mass extinction events, so we can ask how those reshape life. And then I also do a lot of work in southern Utah in the late Cretaceous, so about 10 million years before the last dinosaurs, where we're finding all sorts of different new species of dinosaurs and other animals, and trying to figure out why that is, because there were plenty of connections with areas to the north and the south in Western North America, from Arctic Canada all the way to Mexico. And a very ambitious dinosaur could have walked north to south quite easily. So why do we see different species? Why don't we see the same species across the whole region?
Oh, that's really cool. Thank you so much for sharing with us. So we already have a question here from our friend from Park City, Allison. She's been working with us like this whole week in our Cleveland Light investigation, and she also wants to be a paleontologist. And she wants to know from you, what's your favorite dinosaur?
Ooh, my favorite dinosaur. That's one of the toughest questions for me, actually.
I know,
right? I always say it's whatever species of dinosaur I'm doing research on at the time. But I know that's not a satisfactory answer for a lot of people. So
I think that's awesome.
I usually say Coelophysis, because it's a Triassic dinosaur, small meat-eating dinosaur that's found in New Mexico, one of the areas where I work.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I know this question is hard, and sometimes people say, oh, maybe like the last dinosaur that someone mentioned is my favorite one for the day.
Exactly.
That's so cool. So we have a question, Nash from Smithville in Utah. He's saying, he's asking, how do you find dinosaur bones? Oh, and we also have here, I think, a picture of your favorite dinosaur of the moment.
Yes, there we go. There's Coelophysis itself, and there's a site in New Mexico where hundreds of skeletons were found in one deposit, in a place called Ghost Ranch, which is really cool. So how do we find dinosaur bones? Well, that's a fantastic question. So if I'm working at the museum, I just get to go into the collections or the exhibits, but we have to get them out of the ground first and find them in the field. And so initially, when we're looking for new sites, new specimens, we're really just hiking all across the area. So we sort of know ahead of time where rocks of the correct age and correct type of environment are. You don't typically find dinosaurs in ocean deposits because they lived on land, for example. So you need to know a little bit about the geology. Then you go to the area, and then it's really a matter of hiking around and looking for little pieces of bone on the surface. And sometimes you find nothing at all. Sometimes you find little fragments that you can't find any more of. But occasionally you can trace those fragments of bone, fossil bone, up the hill and find where the bone is eroding out of the rock. And if you're lucky, there's more of the bone or even more of the skeleton there. A lot of times we just find individual bones, but very occasionally we find more of the skeleton, which gets us really excited. And then we have to excavate it.
Awesome. That's really cool. And I think it's important to mention Dr. Mark Lowen was with us on like 2 days ago, and he was talking about like how rare it is to find like a full like skeleton of like a dinosaur, like all of them. And that's something that students always ask us, like if it's like in the Jurassic Park, like you find the whole thing like on the ground. And so have you ever found like an entire one, and how difficult it is?
It is incredibly rare to find a complete or even nearly complete skeleton. They're so rare because there's a couple of reasons. One is before the skeleton gets buried by sediment, by soil or sand or whatever, pieces can get washed away or scavengers can pull the skeleton apart. And then on the sort of more recent side of things, the only way we really find fossils is by erosion. So erosion's our best friend because it exposes the bones for us to see them on the surface, but it's also our enemy because it can destroy parts of the bones if it's exposed for too long. So sometimes there might have been a complete skeleton at one time, but parts of it already got destroyed by modern erosion. The closest I personally have come to that is when I was an undergraduate student, I got a chance to join a crew from Yale University that was doing field work in the Circle Cliffs area of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Triassic rocks. And I was lucky enough to find what turned out to be a skeleton of a very strange looking creature called Poposaurus. It looks like a small meat-eating dinosaur, but it's actually a crocodile ancestor that walked on 2 legs upright. So it looks nothing like modern crocodiles. So it's really cool animal. And all the bones that were found were in life position. They were still like, you know, all the finger bones were still in the right position and attached to each other, all the way down to the tip of the tail. Except we didn't find any of the head or the neck because probably the preceding 200 to 300 years of erosion had already washed it away. So I got there too late.
Still but it's just a lot. It's still found like a lot. Yeah, it's really, we were lucky, I guess. And we have a blog post about Poposaurus on the museum website if you want to read more about that strange animal. That's really cool. That's really cool. Thank you. So yesterday in our investigation, our research class investigation, students were playing. They were working with the Dino Lab, like it's like the game. They were building the dinosaur, and they were naming their dinosaurs. So that came like with the questions about naming dinosaurs. So Allison from Park City, she's also asking, how do you name dinosaurs? Man, we're getting all sorts of fantastic questions this morning. Yeah, naming dinosaurs, believe it or not, there is a book this thick about how to name species of animals. And
and there's a similar book that thick about naming plants. And these rules apply to all plants and animals, whether you're talking about living ones or extinct ones. And there's even a whole organization that basically sets these rules called the International Commission of Zoological Nomenclature, really long name. But basically, we have a set number of rules about how you can name things. And the key thing is that you can't, so scientific names are comprised of two parts, the genus and the species. So if you take, for example, us, Homo sapiens, Homo is the genus, sapiens is a species. Tyrannosaurus rex, Tyrannosaurus is the genus, and Rex is the species. And there can be one or many species within one genus. And one of the critical parts is that when you name a new species, it has to be placed in a genus, and the genus name has to be unique. It can't be something that has been named before. So you can't use Tyrannosaurus for another thing. It's got to be unique to that genus. But the species name can be reused. So I could name something Triceratops rex, and it would, if it was a new species of Triceratops, and that would be okay. But I can't reuse Tyrannosaurus. Then you also have to, you can use names from any language, but they have to be what's called Latinized. So they have to follow the rules of Latin grammar, which is challenging because, you know, most of us don't learn Latin in school anymore.
No.
But that's cool because it means, you know, you see dinosaur names that use the language of whatever country they're found in, or indigenous languages. So that's really neat. And then there's a whole bunch of other rules that we won't go into, and that's why the book is this thick. But it is, to get to the question, it is really one of the most fun parts of science is coming up with new species name, because there's all sorts of options. And there's a really cool book that is made for scientists that has just Latin and Greek words and their translations. So you can look this up and come up with all sorts of fun new names to use. So
that's awesome. And I think it was Carrie who mentioned like once that you cannot name like a dinosaur like a new species like after yourself, right? You can name after like another scientist.
That's right. That's one of the rules. The scientist naming it can't name it after themselves, which is good rule. But I wonder if some scientists have cheated by naming it after the last name of their family, you know, saying it's someone else, but, you know.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. That's possible. So we have also a question from Mary Orr from New York. And she was asking, how do you figure out like what happened in the past with the fossils?
Ooh, well, that's a really tough one to answer, because I think that's what paleontology is all about. As you've seen from doing if you've done one of the Cleveland Lloyd lessons on Research Quest, it's really this grand detective story, and where you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, you don't have all the information. And so that's why it's so important that we come up with many different hypotheses or ideas or inferences that we can then test by gathering different lines of evidence that we do have, but knowing that we don't have the full picture. And our ideas might change in the future as we get more information. And I like to think of geology and paleontology as science. You know, we often think of science as an experiment, and in geology and paleontology, the Earth has run a natural experiment unbroken for 4.6 billion years. So it's done the experiment for us, but we have to go into the geologic and fossil record to gather the results of that experiment to understand what happened. And that's what we're doing in paleontology. So, you know, we look for clues on the bones themselves. We look for clues, a lot of clues in the rocks that the bones were found in. Actually, that's so important. That's why information about where the fossil was found and why and how it was found and exact location is as important, if not more important, than the fossil itself. That context tells us so much about what happened to the organism before it died, when it died, after it died, how it got buried, did it get transported, things like that. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do, and that's why I love it. It's like there's an infinite number of sort of murder mysteries out there to solve, and we don't always get the right answer, or our answer changes as we get new information.
Yeah, that's awesome. We also tell, like, we always tell kids how, like, scientists, they're kind of like detectives sometimes, trying to find out like what happened and using evidence. So that's so cool. So we have a lot of questions, and we have some questions about the topic of like past and change, like, because you mentioned that habits change a lot, like over time. So how did Utah look different in like the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous?
Yeah, the environments across the globe have changed a lot through time, and I encourage you also, after this is done, go check out our virtual field trips on the museum website, because we have a video all about this, a couple videos about Utah's changing landscape through time. And so today Utah is predominantly a desert, and so pretty dry. But back in the Triassic period, for example, at the beginning of the age of dinosaurs, much of Utah was covered by sort of a low floodplain that had many rivers and streams crisscrossing it. It wasn't though like a rainforest by any means. It was pretty open. You would have had a wet season and a dry season. So very seasonal conditions. So sometimes really warm and dry, other times warm and wet. And then there would have been a shallow ocean somewhere along the Utah-Nevada border, what's now the Utah-Nevada border. In the Jurassic period, there's a lot of things going on. In the early Jurassic, things really dried out, and most of Utah and the western US was covered by a desert with lots of sand. But it wasn't like super dry like the Sahara Desert today. There were definitely areas with trees growing and ponds and whatnot. In the middle Jurassic, it got sea levels rose, and parts of Utah got flooded by a warm, shallow seaway. And then other parts were still desert. And then as that seaway retreated, as sea levels went down, you had sort of this big sort of river valley floodplain area again in the late Jurassic, which preserves all our favorite dinosaurs like Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Barosaurus, the ones you studied in Cleveland Lloyd. So that's how we get there. And through most of the Cretaceous, Utah was covered by rivers and streams that were draining towards the east. But the difference there is that you started to have the mountains building in western Utah and eastern Nevada. And so that caused a lot more water and sediment to run into these rivers and out to the east. And for much of the late Cretaceous, there was a shallow seaway in eastern Utah. So things changed a lot. I could go on, but I'm sure we have a lot more questions to get.
But awesome. That was like a good overview, like, of the differences. Thank you so much. And before we continue, I just want to remind everybody who's watching that if you want to leave a question for Randy, just press the Ask a Question button or leave a comment for us on Facebook. So we have some questions about like new discoveries, and like also like what like students or like people can do if they find a fossil. Yep. So we have a question like David via Facebook is asking, do you have recommendations where to send photos of specimens to help identify them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you see something that when you're out hiking and that you think is a fossil, the best thing to do is to leave it where it is and take lots of photos. Not only take some close-up photos of what the object looks like, but also take some photos showing the context, like show a ridge line or trees in the background so that someone can go back and locate it. And if you have a GPS with you, or your phone. You can get free GPS apps for your phone, and you can take a coordinate, GPS coordinate. That's always helpful as well. And the best thing to do is write your local museum, and send them a couple of the best photos and the coordinate, GPS coordinate, and ask them what they think it is. The reason why we want to leave it where it is that it really depends on the type of fossil and what land you're on, whether you can pick it up. And until you know that for sure, it's best to leave it where it is. So for example, no matter what type of fossil it is, if you're on private land, you'd need the permission of the landowner to pick anything up. And then on public land, if it's a vertebrate fossil, any sort of fossil from an animal with a backbone, including footprints, you need a scientific permit from the land agency to do anything. So it's easier just to leave things where it is until you know who owns the land and what it is. And just, yeah, ask your local museum.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And we also got a question like if there are like any type of fossil that someone can keep if they find, or like even like small ones. And I think it's important like for you to answer that.
Yeah, there are some fossils that it is legal to collect, but it depends again on the land ownership and what type of fossil. So on regular BLM land and Forest Service land, US Forest Service and BLM land, you can pick up from the surface fossils of invertebrates, so shells and things like that, and plants, and petrified wood, but you can't dig in and take them. And also, that's if it's a special like BLM or Forest Service land, like it's part of a national monument, then you can't pick it up. So it's got to be sort of normal, no special type of land, BLM or Forest Service. It depends on the state you're in, whether you can do that on state land. But as I mentioned, you can't ever pick up vertebrate fossils from anywhere, really. And in Park Service land, so national parks, national recreation areas, national monuments, you also cannot pick up any type of fossil. So it's, as long as you follow the rules, it's okay. But as you can see, the rules, at least here in the US, are very complicated. So you definitely want to educate yourself before you do anything.
Sure, yeah, that's important to mention. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We got a question from Salt Lake City. It's a long question, so maybe I'm going to break it like in parts. Yeah. So Alexander is asking, do you support a fairly recent theory about coelophysis? Did I say that right?
Coelophysis,
okay.
Yep.
Sorry. He's saying that in Gulls Ranch, there was a strange thing found where about half of the coelophysis are thin, the other half are robust. So something, this is the difference in genders. So what do you think?
Yeah, so that's wow, someone's really has deep knowledge about coelophysis. I like that. So yeah, so because so many skeletons of coelophysis were found in one deposit, it's a great example of a sort of set of fossils to look at variation in a population. Because for a lot of dinosaurs, we only have one or two or maybe half a dozen skeletons. But like Allosaurus from Cleveland-Lloyd, coelophysis, we have a lot of different skeletons and bones, so we can ask questions about variation. And people had noticed that there were some differences in how sort of chunky the bones were, so to speak. We say how robust or gracile, but like basically, are they really thick for their length, or are they relatively narrow? And then some of the individual features on the bones, like what muscle scars, so areas, little rough patches where the muscles attached to the bones. And people had noticed differences in how well developed those were. And for a long time, it had been proposed that maybe these were the two different sexes, male and female, but not knowing which is which. But recent work by one of my colleagues and his graduate student has looked at this in more detail, and it turns out that it doesn't appear to be the differences in sex. Rather, it just seems to be random variation. It looks like early dinosaurs had a lot of variation, especially when they were younger, in terms of how well developed these things are. And that's a feature we see across most early dinosaurs. And then interestingly, things seem to have changed as you got later. So by the time you get in the meat-eating dinosaur family tree to something like Allosaurus, things are much more consistent. And we're not exactly sure why that is, but it makes it tough to study early dinosaurs because it means if you see differences, if you don't have hundreds of skeletons like Coelophysis, and you find a new skeleton and it looks a bit different than the old one, is that variation representing a different species, or does it just represent this large amount of variation that naturally was in the populations?
Thank you so much. So connecting to this question, we want to ask, like, from our Research Quest team, we have a question because you mentioned that there were like a lot of Coelophysis at Ghost Ranch, and so do you see any similarities between this Ghost Ranch and the Cleveland Lloyd's like mass Allosaurus population? Yeah.
Wow, all the questions are just phenomenal. This is great. Yeah, so that's a great question because there are some similarities, even though the two sites are separated by 60, 50, 60 million years in time. They're both unusual in that they're dominated by a single species of meat-eating dinosaur. So both sites have other species preserved of dinosaurs and other animals, but they're quite rare. And as you know from going through all of you who have done the Cleveland Lloyd Research Quest, it's I don't know, 75, 80, 90% is Allosaurus, this one species, large meat-eating dinosaur, and the Coelophysis cory Ghost Ranch is the same thing. And that's really weird because usually in a fossil deposit, plant eaters are more common, just because if you go out to the landscape today, you're more likely to see plant eaters than meat eaters. You're more likely to see a deer than you are a bobcat, for example. And that's just because of how the food pyramid is, right? There's fewer meat eaters than plant eaters, because if there were too many meat eaters, they wouldn't have anything to eat. They'd eat all the plant eaters and they'd go extinct. So generally, we expect to see more plant eaters in the fossil record, and that's usually what we see during the age of dinosaurs. But it's Cleveland Lloyd and the Coelophysis cory Ghost Ranch are exceptions, and we actually have other sites from throughout the age of dinosaurs that are dominated by meat-eating dinosaurs. And so this leads us to think, if we put all these sites together, that this suggests that at least at some point in their life, these meat-eating dinosaurs were hanging out together. They were social in some way. They weren't just solitary. And if we just had one site, if we just had Cleveland Lloyd, that wouldn't be a very strong hypothesis. But the fact that we have many sites with different species of meat-eating dinosaurs through time showing the same pattern seems to support it. And then if we need to think about the descendants of meat-eating dinosaurs, birds today, and so many birds are social and live in groups. So it makes a lot of sense, right, that their ancestors might have done that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think you kind of like already answered a little bit, but we had a question. Max from Salt Lake City was asking, what do you think happened in Cleveland Lloyd? So yeah, I think you all already mentioned some aspects, but like, what do you think specifically could happen there?
Yeah, I don't have a full answer for you. I think there's still a lot to figure out, because I think there is evidence that at least some of these Allosaurus were together in life because of this pattern we see. I think there's also plenty of evidence that the sediments they're preserved in are from, a river, and that some of the bone, there's evidence that some of the bones were washed around or transported. So some aspect of the float and bloat hypothesis is correct, but that doesn't then answer why the animals died upstream. And I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. It does, you know, I don't think we necessarily know exactly why they might have died upstream, but it is clear that probably at least some of them were killed at the same time together because they were hanging out together, and that they got washed downstream at least a little bit. But beyond that, I don't have a good answer. I think hopefully all of you are, you know, become paleontologists and can help us figure this out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, no, that's good. Like if you don't have an answer, that's totally fine, because that's like science is like always changing, and people are also finding different things. So that's really cool. So we saw like last week, I think, a new discovery about the Spinosaurus, like about the tail. So can you like tell us like a little bit like about that, if you've heard about this, and also like what does it mean for this species specifically?
Yeah, Spinosaurus is a really cool meat-eating dinosaur, and it's one of these dinosaurs that for the longest time, although it was really popular because it made it into all the dinosaur books and whatnot, and it's really strange looking with this sail on its back, we actually didn't know a lot about it. So its popularity sort of was much more than what we knew about it scientifically. And part of that is because for the longest time, all we had was one partial skeleton that was mostly parts of the backbone that had been found in Egypt in the early 20th century. And they were in a museum in Munich, Germany, and the museum got bombed in World War II, and the fossil was destroyed. So all we had was pictures of the skeleton, and we didn't know a lot about it. But much more recently, people have started to find more fossils of it in North Africa, particularly in Morocco, and it's totally changed our view of what the animal looked like. And initially, we knew for a long time that the environment it lived in was a coastal environment similar to like mangrove swamps. And with the really long snout and lots of teeth that sort of remind us of a crocodile, people had proposed maybe it was specialized for hanging out along the coast and eating animals that lived in the water, like fish and things like that. And then more recently, people started to find more of the animal, like more of the legs and arms. And there was the proposal that, wow, it really does look like maybe it was swimming. But a lot of paleontologists were still skeptical because different bones were found from different skeletons. So it was hard to figure out the proportions of the animal. But now with this new discovery, they found more of the same skeleton as the leg bones, and that included the tail. And as you can see in this image, the tail doesn't look like a normal sort of slender dinosaur tail. The spines of the vertebrae that you can see on the top there are really elongate, and the chevrons, which are the things that hang down, those are basically they're modified sort of tail ribs is the best way to think of them. They're really long too, and so it gives this really tall, narrow, flexible tail that is great for propelling yourself through the water. And it's cool because we see a lot of other animals that evolve tails like this when they're swimming, spending time in the water. So it's consistent with what we know from other animals that are unrelated to Spinosaurus. So it really does seem like this is a giant, meat-eating dinosaur that's as long as Tyrannosaurus rex, but is, swimming in the water. Whether it spent all of its time in the water, probably not. It probably still spent plenty of time on land, but it was going in the water when it needed to find something to eat.
That's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I think also connected to this question, we also wanted to ask, like, how long does it take to make like a discovery like that? Because you were talking about like how like paleontologists were discussing about this for some time.
Yeah, that's, it depends on how long you consider, but in that case, the first fossils were found in the, I think, 1920s or 1930s. And it wasn't until the 2000s that really much more of the skeleton was discovered, and only the last few years that this tail was found. And so it can take a century or more before we learn more about an animal. But if you mean from like when the fossil's discovered in the field till the research is published, that also can take a long time. So it may take a few weeks or a few months to excavate a skeleton. Sometimes it takes a couple years. But then in the lab, it'll take thousands of hours to remove the bones from the rock and stabilize them, glue them together. And then only once that's done can we really start the research, and that can take several years. And finally, once you write up the research in a scientific paper, it has to go through a process called peer review. So before a scientific journal publishes your research, they send it to a couple of other experts to get their opinion. And usually they have a strong opinion, and they say, oh, I agree or disagree with this, and you have to change this. And so then you have to revise the paper. And so all this is a very long process, and only once the scientific paper is published can we actually announce the new find to the world. And so when you hear about a new discovery, that's the very end of a long process. So Dr. Mark Bowen was on the Research Quest earlier this week, and he was just part of this announcement a few months ago of a new species of Allosaurus jimmadsoni. So that was announced end of January 2020, but that fossil was excavated in the early 1990s. So that gives you a sense of how long it can take. Not all are that long, sometimes it's shorter, but yeah, it can take usually several years between discovery and publication.
Awesome. Yeah, it looks like a long process. But yeah, that's really cool. Thank you. So we got a question here with a specific, again, Mary from Salt Lake City is asking, okay, so ceratopsian frills are like decorative display or shields?
So, display or what? Or
shields, like they're like
shields, yeah.
Sorry.
Defense. Great question again, and could be both. So here we have our awesome ceratopsian wall, our horned dinosaur skulls that are mounted on the wall of our museum, with the white lines showing the evolutionary tree, the family tree, how they're related. And you can see they each have their own crazy arrangement of horns and spikes and different shaped bony frills coming off the back of their head. And I think there's no doubt that they were for display, at least partly, because each species has its own arrangement and shape. And that's very indicative of features that are used for display because they're species, what we call species specific. Each species has its own thing going on. That said, that doesn't mean they couldn't also have been used for defense. That's why we have multiple hypotheses or ideas in science that we test, because they're often, both of them could be right. And certainly some of the horns, especially on Triceratops at the very top, right, those would be pretty effective to help defend yourself. But then you can see some of the other animals, they have really big holes in their frills. And so maybe those aren't as effective for defense. And so I think a combination of possibilities, but display is definitely seems to be part of it.
It's really cool. Yeah, and this picture is so awesome. So we have a question here, another question from Alexander from Salt Lake City. He's asking, why does Utah have such great fossil representation?
Yeah, Utah is a great place for paleontology. I mean, I'm biased, but I think it's one of the best in the United States. And that's down to a few things. One is our geology. So we only find fossils in sedimentary rocks. And most of Utah, at least the rocks that are exposed on the surface, are sedimentary rocks. So we've got the right type of rocks. And they range very widely in geologic age. So we have rocks that are over 1 billion years old in Utah, and then we have rocks that are just a few thousand years old. And so we have a lot of different time intervals that have fossils in them, and many different environments, as we talked about earlier, from oceans to rivers to lakes to deserts. And each of those preserve different fossils. And then the other big thing is just in the current climate and environment of Utah. Because we're a desert, we don't have a lot of vegetation, a lot of plants that are growing over the rocks and obscuring them from our view as paleontologists. So we have all these beautiful sort of canyons and badlands and red rocks that you see in Utah, and they're not covered up, so we can really find fossils easily. And also, most of our cities and towns are concentrated in a relatively small area. So we've got the Wasatch Front urban area where we are in Salt Lake City, and then there's some smaller cities and towns throughout, but most of it is undeveloped, so we don't have buildings covering our rocks either. In fact, New York City, a large part of the area around New York City has rocks from the beginning of the age of dinosaurs, the Triassic and early Jurassic, and they have fossils in them. It's just hard to find them, those fossils, because they're either covered by vegetation or buildings.
Thank you so much. So before we continue, I just want to remind everybody who's watching that if you have a question for Randy, just please press the Ask a Question button or leave a comment for us on Facebook. And we have some questions coming. We have another question from Alexander. I think, yeah, he's really interested here in your opinion. He's from Salt Lake City, and he's asking, what's your view of the Torosaurus is a Triceratops theory?
Okay. So there's many different species of horned dinosaurs, but probably the most famous is Triceratops. It's got two big horns over the eyes and one smaller horn over its nose, and then a big solid bony frill, no holes in the bony frill behind it, from the very, very end of the age of dinosaurs, living alongside Tyrannosaurus rex. But there's a lesser known species of horned dinosaur from the same time, and sometimes the same place, called Torosaurus. It has a similar arrangement of horns, but instead of having a solid bony frill, it's got pretty big holes in the bony frill like we saw in some of the other horned dinosaurs. And it's very big. It's got one of the biggest skulls of any horned dinosaur. And so a few years ago, some paleontologists proposed that actually they were the same species, and that Triceratops were the sort of young, sort of teenagers, so to speak, and Torosaurus are the older adults. And so as the animal got older and bigger, the frill got bigger, but it actually sort of what we call some of the bone got resorbed, which is actually something that happens. Our bodies move bone around all the time, and it actually, we have cells that take it away from one area and redeposit it elsewhere. So that can happen. So you could develop these holes in the frill. And it could kind of make sense in the sense that we don't, Torosaurus is really rare, and we only find really big examples, or we had only found really big examples. So maybe those were just the old animals of Triceratops. But I think I still think they're separate species, and part of the reason is evidence from here in Utah. So in places like Wyoming or South Dakota, you find both Torosaurus and Triceratops. But here in Utah, in central Utah, we have a formation from the very end of the age of dinosaurs called the North Horn Formation. It includes, we've got Utah's only Tyrannosaurus rex is found in that formation. And it's weird though, because the only horned dinosaur we find in the North Horn Formation is Torosaurus. We don't find any Triceratops. And that's the complete opposite of what you find everywhere else, where you find lots of Triceratops, but very few Torosaurus. So if they were the same species, I'd expect that we'd find at least a few Triceratops here in Utah, but we don't. So that seems to suggest to me that they are separate species, and it's just Torosaurus is so rare we haven't found any young animals yet, but they're probably out there.
Awesome. And that's great that you mentioned like this changes and when they grow, because we have a question specifically about that. Amber via Facebook, she's asking on the subject of the frills. or frills, I'm not sure, sorry. I've noticed some of the frills are different between juvenile and mature adults. So can you talk about the process of frill maturity?
That's a great observation. And it's one of the other reasons we think the frills are for display, in that they don't reach their final shape and form until close to adulthood. And that's pretty typical of animals that have structures for display. And they definitely change a lot. So there's a few species where we have a good growth series from very young to adult. Triceratops is one of them. And the babies look really adorable with these sort of oversized heads and small, tiny frills and little, tiny little horns. And the shape and relative size definitely changes a lot as they grow up. There's another horned dinosaur called Centrosaurus from Canada, where we have a lot of hundreds of individuals. And again, we see similar thing that the frills start out kind of small and the horns kind of small, and then proportionally they get bigger over time and also change their shape in terms of curvature and things like that. And here in Utah too, we particularly a horned dinosaur called Utaceratops gettyi from Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. That now we found a number of juveniles and adults, and we can see that the shape of the frill changes quite a bit. And the little knobs on the edge of the frill actually change their shape quite a bit. They're very pointy and triangular in the young animals, and then they get sort of longer but more curved in the adults. When our museum is open again, you can actually come into our Past Worlds exhibit and see this mounted skeleton of both a juvenile, young individual and an adult Utaceratops.
Awesome. And you can see a picture, who is like watching can see a picture that we have like in our museum website. And also, I think we also have like some virtual field trips already like up in the website. So if you go under the For Educators tab on the top part, and if you click there, you can see that there's like some online resources there. And there you can find some virtual field trips. And I think you participated in the one about the Past World, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so that's also cool. It's also, of course, like not the same thing, but who wants to like watch and like learn a little bit about our museum, it's a really fun way as well. So we also have a question that I think is like really interesting to ask for you right now, that like Tina from Oregon is asking, what makes a dinosaur, and why isn't a pteranodon?
So why is it?
Sorry. Why isn't a pteranodon?
Ah, yeah, yes.
Not a, sorry.
No worries, yeah. See, us paleontologists, we like to use very complicated names that are hard to pronounce. Because so many names are Greek and Latin, so even us paleontologists don't know how to pronounce them. That's okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, that's a really good question, because dinosaurs are just one of many types of extinct and living reptile. And so what differentiates them? It's not just because they're big and dead. So they form a sort of a natural grouping that have several characteristics that are unique to them. And probably the easiest one to see on a skeleton is that the hip socket, the part of the pelvis that the leg bone fits into, if you look at it carefully, you'll notice it's a hole. There's no bone opposite where the head of the leg bone fits into the hole, into the depression there. It's completely hollow all the way through. Whereas if you look at mammals or other reptiles or amphibians, the place where the leg bone fits into the pelvis is just a depression. There's still bone behind it. And so that's probably the easiest feature to see. There's a couple of other very minor skeletal features that differentiate dinosaurs, but you have to get really up close to see them. And so the person asked about a pteranodon, one of these flying reptiles. That's an example of a pterosaur or pterodactyl. And they're closely related to dinosaurs, but they're not dinosaurs. And if you look at one of their skeletons carefully, you'll see that, again, the hip socket still has bone behind it. It's just this depression as opposed to a complete hole. And that's what's cool, is that both dinosaurs, pterosaurs or pterodactyls, and crocodiles, they belong to a bigger reptile group called archosaurs. And so it shows us that archosaurs, the reptiles, they evolved flight twice. So meat-eating dinosaurs evolved into birds, and the ancestors of pterodactyls evolved into pterosaurs. And that's really crazy, because there's only one other example of animals with backbones evolving powered flight, which is bats, which are a type of mammal. So, so it's kind of cool that this one group of reptiles did it twice.
That's so cool. I didn't know that. That's so awesome. We're also talking a little bit about like books for people who are like interested in like paleontology, or kids who want to be paleontologists. So do you have any recommendation of books for any, like, it can be like for like adults or like your young readers? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always a bad person to ask this question, because there's so many books out there. It's hard to answer in general, and I'm not as up on the, especially like young adult level books as I should be. I know there are some really good ones out there, but the titles don't spring to mind exactly. So, and then there's a ton of sort of popular science adult books that are out there, and paleontology is a really big topic that is really popular for authors to talk about. So it's hard to give a sort of general paleontology recommendation. So it's easier if there's more specific topics you're interested in.
Oh yeah, no, that's totally okay. We also got a question, like more light type of question. Allison from Brick City was asking if you have a favorite dinosaur movie.
A favorite dinosaur movie? That's a good question. Well, of course, given my age, I'm a bit partial to the very original Jurassic Park from '92 or whenever that was. That's still by far the best Jurassic Park movie as far as I'm concerned. The only one worth watching. No, I'm just kidding. But there are lots of classics. I mean, even though it's totally unscientific, I mean, the original King Kong is amazing, with this beautiful stop motion animation of models. Really, really cool. And I think that was that's been influential on a lot of future paleontologists. Yeah, let's see. But I think, as far as if we're talking about movies, yeah, it's either got to be the original King Kong or the original Jurassic Park.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think you're the first one who mentioned the first King Kong one, and I remember. It's really awesome. Thank you. We got a question from Facebook. Kathleen is asking, what big question or mystery about dinosaurs would you most like to solve? She has another question related to have there been any transformative discoveries in the last few years that really changed the way paleontologists think about dinosaurs? So if you want to answer the first one, I can ask the second one again.
man, people are asking all the hard questions. Which are the good ones, though. The hard questions are good. Unanswered questions I'd like to solve. Wow. There's so many, but I mean, well, so a question that's occupied a lot of my own research that we still don't, have a complete answer for, is why dinosaurs became so successful. And we have some ideas, but I think it's still largely unanswered. And why, in the Triassic period, there's a huge diversity of different types of reptiles living on land, and all sorts of weird and wonderful creatures. Is one of the reasons I really love the Triassic. And yet many of them die out. Those branches of the reptile family tree die out by the end of the Triassic, but dinosaurs are one of the branches that survive and then flourish for the rest of the Mesozoic era and really becomes dominant on land. And so an enduring question has been why did dinosaurs become so successful? Was it just luck, that they happened to survive the extinction at the end of the Triassic, whereas others didn't? Or was there something about them that they were better adapted to what they were doing and allowed them to survive in a better way, more of the species to survive and then diversify? And I still don't think we have a full answer. One of the things that's become clear is that it really depends on where you are in the world. Like dinosaurs didn't become successful at the same time across the globe. Here in North America, it took them a lot longer than in places like South America, Southern Africa, and Europe. And we think that might have something to do with climate, but it's still a really open question, and especially that question about did they have any particular adaptations that made them successful. And then the second question, I believe, was transformative discoveries over the past few years.
Yeah, if there was like anything that any like new discoveries that really like changed the way the paleontologists think about dinosaurs.
There's a ton that I could go into, but I think now's a really exciting time for dinosaurs because we can apply all these new techniques, sort of laboratory analyses, but also computer modeling, things like that. But probably the one I'd pick, just because it's the one that comes to mind. Oh, excuse me, one that comes to mind first is has to do with feathers. And not necessarily that many dinosaurs, meat-eating dinosaurs, were covered in feathers, but the fact that we could use the feathers to reconstruct the color of dinosaurs. If you asked me even 20 years ago or 15 years ago, whether we would ever know what color dinosaurs were, I'd probably say, no, there's no way we're going to be able to tell. But some really clever paleontologists figured out that there was a way to tell, at least when you had these special fossils of dinosaurs with feathers preserved. And that's because lots of feathers, most of the colors of feathers come from these little structures in the feathers called melanosomes that have different types of pigment that give the color to the feather. And it turns out that the shape and size of those little structures called the melanosomes actually relate to what color you see. And you can look at these melanosomes under an electron microscope. And so what these folks did is they looked at modern bird feathers and measured hundreds and thousands of melanosomes to relate size and shape to color. And then they took the dinosaur fossils of the dinosaur feathers and looked at those under scanning electron microscope and measured those. And from that, they were able to reconstruct what color the feathers were of a lot of these feathered meat-eating dinosaurs. And it's just super cool. And it turns out that some other structures, like some scales, sometimes have melanosomes. So even some scaled animals, fossil animals, we've been able to reconstruct color too. And it's shown us that just like modern birds, dinosaurs were really brightly colored in a lot of cases. And that also lends evidence to display being really important.
So cool. That's awesome. And everybody who's watching can like see the pictures we're sharing. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I think one of our like final questions, and that's our like research team question, would be like, how can students like middle schoolers, high schoolers like start to participate like in paleontology if they are like interested? Because we have a lot of students who are.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, and the individual opportunities depend on where you are and what your local museum does. But a lot of museums have programs for youth at middle schools and high schoolers to get involved. And then once you reach a certain age, you can often volunteer at a lot of museums and actually help out, get trained to work in the paleontology lab, or even potentially go out in the field. So I encourage you to check out what opportunities are available at your local museum. And the other thing is just staying engaged with the the community of people at the museum and local scientists, and take advantage of opportunities when you hear about them. And then particularly once you get to high school and college, then there's a lot of possibilities to get involved in the science itself and actually do research. Um, and so other than that, I always say practice your writing skills. It's often, we often think about science as being very different from sort of writing in the arts, but in fact, there's a lot of overlap, and something I do more than anything else is write. And so being able to write effectively is really critical.
Awesome. That's so great. So unfortunately, we are out of time now with our interview, but I want to thank you so much for participating. That was really cool. I think everybody learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. All the questions were incredible, really awesome questions. It was so much fun.
Yeah, our viewers, they have awesome questions. We are always surprised. It's so awesome. And I want to thank everybody who's watching. Thank you so much for watching our interview and sending your questions. They were really amazing. And I want to invite everybody for next Monday to tune in with our research class. We have class 9:30 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We're going to continue with some wind investigations with our friend Andy. So thank you so much. See you all. Bye. Thank you, Randy.
Bye. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
You too.